We're beginning to pull the old steering linkage out, and here you can see how terrible the old system is. The old system steers from behind the spindle. It's kind of dark and hard to see here, but this system takes up a lot of space, and it causes for a lot of clearance issues when it comes to V motors. Just because they tend to be rear sump or mid sump. And, you know, looking at this old suspension system here, you can see this is the lower control arm. This is also the lower control arm. So you can see that when Chevy designed this in the 1960s, it wasn't really designed for sturdiness or safety, really. This is essentially just dowel rod connected to the lower control arm. Of course, it's strong dowel rod, but it doesn't instill a lot of confidence when you look at it. And you know, as I'm pulling this old system apart, there are a lot of castle nuts with a lot of cotter pins, and whoever the original owner was did a great job of replacing the old cotter pins because they are coming out quite easily. Most of my experience with cotter pins is that they're very brittle and they snap. So to have something that comes out quite easily is a joy and speeds up the process, because these cotter pins have a tendency to get brittle, and when you pull them out, they or when you try to pull them out, they break and the castellated nut won't move. So just having cotter pins that aren't brittle is one of those few joys you have in life when it comes to working on older cars. Yeah, I'm gonna set the camera down and get the rest of this lower control arm setup off and see some more footage. This is me taking off the upper control assembly, which the spindle bolts to, and the suspension comes off pretty easily. There's only a couple bolts. There's the big spindle bolt that goes to the lower control arm, there's the tie rod that goes to the steering rack, and then there is the upper ball joint that has 3 bolts that you undo, and it all comes out right out. And it's pretty easy. It doesn't take that long. It's not like a modern car where it takes forever to fight the bolts off. There's just the right amount of torque on them, and they came out pretty quickly. The next thing that came out of the car was the lower control arm, and how this works is there is a giant camber bolt that is attached to the lower control arm, and that adjusts how far the lower control arm is pushed out. It's cambered, so if you pull it out further, it pushes the arm out further, which will make negative camber. This is a very antiquated system. All it is a giant bolt that runs through the frame, and there's a nut that holds it in place, and you undo the nut and the bolt, and it all comes out, and the lower control arm drops out as one piece. The next part that comes out is the cross member, and this is the part that stiffens up the front clip, and Church Boys Racing replaces this cross member with a tubular one, and it's where the rack and pinion bolts up to, making it a lot sturdier than the original cross member. And in addition to that, there are new plates that the lower control arm bolts up to on the front end of the frame, and we are looking at here are the new plates for the back end of the lower control arm. So instead of there being a giant camber bolt that pushes out the control control arm in or out, the lower control arm is threaded on the front and the back, so that when you thread the arm in or out, it pushes the camber out, or it pushes the caster in or out. And that makes it a lot easier for suspension setups if you want to street or racing, which makes the Church Boys Racing one of the easiest suspensions to set up. So now that we got our lower control arms in and our tubular cross member as well as our rack and pinion, these are just kind of loosely put in just as a dry fit. Next would be to tighten it all down, torque it down, Loctite everything, and before we get to that, I was going to try and dry fitting the upper arm, and to do that we need to pull this off and this mount so that we can pull out the shock absorber. That way when it comes time to pull the spring out, we can compress the spring with a spring compressor and pull the upper arm and the coil spring off. And that will allow us to mount up the new arm, and we will be able to put all the components back together. Shock absorber comes out from the top. Easy as pie. So this is the spring. We pulled off the, I pulled off this, this is where the bumper stop goes for when the arm travels too high. I pulled that off just so it's easier to pull the spring out. But how the spring compressor works is that it pulls from both directions and it compresses the spring, and when it loosens up I can pull it sideways and the spring will come out, and that way I'll be able to loosen the arm and I'll pull completely out. How that works is that I take this and I turn it to the right, and I keep doing it slowly and incrementally, and we can see that the two prongs and claws that are grabbing the coils of the spring are staying stationary while the threaded rod pulls them together. And I essentially just keep doing this until the spring works itself free. And we got the whole spring out. It was a fairly simple job. It takes quite a bit of wrenching, just because these Nova springs are just really soft, and we can see how tall this spring is, and it needs a lot of travel, and that's what gives 60s cars these really soft motion in the ocean kind of wave and bounce. They just have really soft springs for a comfortable ride, and you do sacrifice handling. You get a wishy-washy feeling. The stiffer generally the suspension goes, the better handling you'll have. But I think I'll be sticking with these springs for now, just to see how the new suspension helps it. And if I don't like how the spring rate feels, I might move something up to a little bit stiffer, and maybe adjustable coilovers too. But right now I'll stick with these springs. There's the old arm out, and now let's get the new arm in. Here we can see the new arm, and this is just a beautiful piece. But we can see here how it compares to the old arm. And we can see that this is just going to be a much stronger piece, and it's just going to be a lot more adjustable too. in terms of caster, and it's just overall going to be better. This is, you know, 60 years of technology newer than what was here in 1963. So I'll get this into the car and we'll see how it looks. So what I'm doing right now is I'm going to be centering our rack and pinion. And what you do is you mark the input shaft spline and you turn the rack all the way to one side, and then you mark it on the housing, and then you turn it all the way to the direct opposite, so to the other lock, and then you mark that, and then the amount of turns it took to go lock to lock, you do half the amount, and your center mark should be between your two markings. And I'm going to do that right now. It's easier to do it when obviously there's no engine in the car, and this will allow me to get my tie rods on, and pretty soon our whole assembly will be good to roll into the garage so I can throw a motor in it.